Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the System Center Configuration Manager 2012 Post-Installation Tasks lesson in the System Center 2012 Configuration Manager training course. In this lesson, you'll learn about the role of the management point and the distribution point as they were created during the System Center Configuration Manager installation process. You'll also learn about the role of what are called the distribution point groups, a new entity in Configuration Manager 2012. You'll also learn about the role that boundaries and boundary groups play in your Configuration Manager environment. And we're going to wrap this lesson up by reviewing other site settings that are important to understand before you move forward in your administrative journey. Specifically in this lesson, you're going to learn that before you start using Configuration Manager, there's some initial configuration that's necessary in order to get things in place in a way that makes sense. You'll also learn about some of the defaults that were created when you first installed Configuration Manager so that you know how things are going to operate. And there's some clear business goals as well that you're going to find as a part of this lesson. First of all, to continue the Configuration Manager deployment. We want to get this product up and running for Global Mantics. We want to make sure we perform well the foundational configuration steps to make sure that we have a solid foundation on which to operate in the future. And make sure we understand some new efficiency opportunities that are available in Configuration Manager 2012. The first role we want to talk about is the management point. And this is a site system role that provides policy and service location information to clients and receives configuration data from clients. It is the foundational role in Configuration Manager. Without a management point, nothing else is really going to work. This is the point that facilitates communication between clients and the Configuration Manager server itself. When we installed Configuration Manager, an initial management point was installed. So basically, we already have a management point installed, so clients, in theory, could begin communicating with Configuration Manager right away. In the olden days, you had to use load balancers for high availability for a management point. Now, clients can simply use Active Directory to find management points in a way that maintains a semblance of high availability. There also used to be a role called the Server Locator Point role. While the services that were previously offered by this role, which help clients identify particular server locations, server roles, have been merged into the management point role itself. So this is another way that Microsoft has simplified Configuration Manager just a little bit. Every primary and secondary site requires that you have a management point installed. If you don't, clients in those sites cannot communicate with site servers. If you have a large deployment and you're using a central administration site, or you have a deployment that requires a larger hierarchy than Global Mantics does, you may have a central administration site. But it should be understood that central administration sites cannot host management points themselves. Only primary and secondary sites can host management points. And secondary sites can use what are called proxy management points. That way you don't have to have a full management point out there for clients. In order for a management point role to be installed, the system to which the management point is going to be deployed must have Internet Information Services and the Background Intelligent Transfer Services features enabled on the server. Because Global Mantics already had these features enabled, the management point role was installed during installation time for Configuration Manager. Now, we have an action item. We'd like to validate the default management point settings as they were established during the installation of Configuration Manager 2012. So, without further ado, we're going to go over to the Global Mantics desktop of the server with Configuration Manager installed, and we're going to take a look at the default management point settings. Here we are at the Global Mantics Configuration Manager desktop, and to find the management point role, I'm going to go to Administration. And you'll notice under Site Configuration, we have an option here for Servers and Site System Roles. And if I select the first server, which is the only server we've installed so far, remember this is the database server on which the Configuration Manager database resides, so there's actually two site servers right now. But if I go to the one that I know has a management point role, you're going to see that this server actually hosts 4 roles: Component Server, Distribution Point, Management Point, and Site Server. If I click Management Point and right-click it and choose Properties, you'll see that there's really very little in the way of configuration for the management point server itself as we see it here. We can choose for client connectivity options of HTTP or HTTPS. You may recall that during installation we chose the HTTP option for now. Later on, we could change this to more secure HTTPS if we like. And we can generate alerts when the management point is not healthy. This is actually something that I like to do because I want to make sure that I know when something is going awry in my configuration manager environments. We'll be looking at alerts later on in this course. On the management point database properties or database page, we can just tell it to use the site database, or we can tell it to use a replica. And then we have the management point connection account. This is the account that the management point will use to access the SQL database. You may recall that we added the computer account for the configuration manager system to the local administrators on the database server earlier on. Well, we're going to use the computer account for the management point, and it's going to use that login to make that happen. Now that you understand the role that it facilitates communication between clients and site servers, let's talk about the distribution point. This is the site system role that contains source files for clients to download, such as application content, software packages, software updates, operating system images, and boot images. In plain English, anything you want to push to a client generally goes through a distribution point. Distribution points have long been a part of the configuration manager hierarchy, and they play a critical role in the distribution of content and the deployment of software, the deployment of patches and operating system deployments, and what have you. As was the case with the management point, a distribution point was installed when we installed Configuration Manager earlier on in this course. There are a number of changes to distribution points in Configuration Manager 2012. First of all, branch distribution points, which were introduced in Configuration Manager 2007, are gone. These were distribution points you could install at a branch office, so you would be able to just download something once over a WAN connection and then distribute it locally. This has been replaced with the ability to configure a Windows client itself as a distribution point. So rather than deploying a complete server at a branch office, you could just use one of your desktops as a distribution point from your configuration manager's head end. The downside with using a client operating system is that there's a 20 connection maximum, so it may take a little longer if you have a particularly large branch office. The Pixie server, the pre-execution environment server point, is now a distribution point option, and it reinstalls the Windows deployment services. The Pixie boot server is used when you're doing things like operating system deployments. Well, this is now a distribution point option, so it's part of the distribution point rather than being its own separate entity. And with a distribution point, you now have to use background intelligent transfer services. Background intelligent transfer services has been around for a while as well, and it's used to better control bandwidth utilization between systems, basically. So it makes the most effective use of bandwidth based on what's available, and it can also do restarts of downloads and things like that make it much better than just a simple download. Distribution points also use what's known as single instance storage, and this is a good thing because there was a day when they didn't. So every individual item, even if it was copied 50 times, used 50 times of disk space. Well, that's not the case anymore. With single instance storage, it's basically a deduplication technology that reduces disk space used for storing content. Deduplication is a big deal these days, and it has been for a while, but it's getting better, and Configuration Manager fully leverages it to reduce the amount of disk space necessary in the environment. The downside to this is you can no longer directly access the content. Whereas before, you were able to very easily access content on a distribution point, it's a little harder now, but that's okay. There's lots of ways around that, and you're going to see those in action in this course. One item that used to plague Configuration Manager environments was the content corruption in a distribution point. Something may have happened where, say, a virus got inserted into a distribution point, and then that virus got deployed throughout the environment, or what have you, or just some kind of corruption ended up taking place in the content. Well, Configuration Manager 2012 now has a content validation technique that helps to prevent content from becoming corrupted. There's also remote distribution point throttling. There used to be a day where if you wanted to control the speed through which content went from a primary site to another site, you would have to create a secondary site for this purpose and then manage bandwidth settings between the sites. That's not the case anymore. This is another way that Microsoft has reduced the need to have organizations create massive hierarchies for what should be minuscule administrative techniques. You shouldn't have to create an entire hierarchy just to manage bandwidth. This is now controlled more easily right on the distribution point. So, this is why Global Mantis can have a single site, a single primary site, and not have to worry about having multiple secondary sites for branch offices. And as was the case for management points, we're going to go over and validate the default distribution point settings as they exist in the Configuration Manager environment for Global Mantix right now. Once again, we're back at the Global Mantix Configuration Manager server desktop, and you'll notice that I'm in the administration area, and I've already selected site configuration, servers and site system roles, and my Configuration Manager site server. One of the site system roles is distribution point. I'll right-click that distribution point and choose properties, which brings up many more properties than we saw when we looked at management point. You'll notice that there's 7 tabs instead of just 2. First of all, we have the ubiquitous general tab, which we see everywhere. And again, this is going to tell us HTTP or HTTPS, if clients can connect anonymously for content, certificate issues, and enable distribution point for pre-staged content. For now, we're not going to worry about these settings because we'll be looking at these later when we actually start distributing content. But understand that this is where you set basically how clients will communicate with the distribution point in a general way. If we're going to do operating system deployments, we need to have a Pixie point. This is a place where a client can boot from, basically get some boot settings to boot over the network. Once we get to the lesson in this course where we do operating system deployments, we will enable the Pixie support for clients checkbox here and configure all of these settings. This is a critical place, a critical point of information though, in Configuration Manager 2012. Remember, Pixie used to be a separate point, a separate management point, in older versions of Configuration Manager. It has now been rolled into the distribution point properties. Multicast is a way to streamline the network impact, or basically reduce the network impact, when you're going to be imaging multiple machines or many machines at once. If you enable multicast, basically it allows multiple computers to consume the same stream of information, thereby not making multiple copies of data go over the network all at the same time. Again, when we get to operating system deployments, you'll see some of this stuff in action. If you have distribution point groups, which are basically newly emphasized in Configuration Manager 2012, this is where you'll see which groups this distribution point participates in. We'll be discussing distribution point groups in just a few minutes. If you have content in the distribution point, you're going to see it here. And as you can see, we already do have some content. By default, Configuration Manager installs a Configuration Manager client package on the distribution point, which we'll be using soon in this course to deploy the client software, out to client machines in the environment. Now remember before I said you could validate client software. To do that, you would simply click the client package, or the package you see here, and click Validate. And then click OK. And then later on we would see in Content Status in the monitoring area for validation status. And we can go there and do that in just a second. You can also choose to validate content on a schedule. So would you like to automate the process of validating your content? Or do you want to do it manually like we just did? If you'd like to validate your content on a schedule, simply click the checkbox and choose a schedule. Now, this could be a relatively CPU-intensive process, but you can choose exactly how important this is to you. I'm just going to accept the defaults and say, when there's basically idle time, go ahead and validate content. And click Apply. Boundary groups have been around boundaries have been around in Configuration Manager for quite a while. You can associate a distribution point with a boundary group. And when you do this, basically clients that are in that boundary group will communicate with this distribution point. We do not have much in the way of boundaries or boundary groups yet, so we're not going to be doing anything here with boundary groups. We'll do that later on in this course. However, understand that boundary group configuration is a part of distribution points and their properties. As you might imagine, distribution points could be considered a single point of failure in a Configuration Manager environment. Therefore, distribution point groups have been newly emphasized in Configuration Manager 2012. This simplifies the process of adding new distribution points. In the olden days, adding a new distribution point meant copying all the content manually in many cases. That's no longer the case because content is now automatically replicated to newly added distribution points. This makes sure that everything is the same across the environment, and this is a wonderful thing. You don't have to worry anymore about something being out of sync between distribution points when you're using distribution point groups. These replace the need to manually populate new distribution points with existing content, and that's really critical because that was a pain before, and it's not anymore. When administrators target distribution point groups, all members receive the content. What I mean by that is, let's say you decide you want to add new software, and so you have to place it somehow into Configuration Manager. When you target a distribution point group as opposed to a single distribution point, every distribution point is going to get that content rather than just a single distribution point. Now on to boundaries, which is a logical grouping that identifies a network location of clients in the Configuration Manager hierarchy. In Configuration Manager 2012, we're talking about boundaries and boundary groups. Each one of these is really a network location that contains clients. Boundaries are all about clients. There are 4 primary boundary types that you can use in Configuration Manager 2012. You can bound clients by IP subnets, by Active Directory site, IPv6 prefixes if you're using IPv6, or just an IP address range, which could be useful if you've got lots of IP address ranges that you want to have separated for whatever reason. Perhaps you've got one massively flat network, but everything's carefully constructed in IP address ranges. Marketing uses a certain range, sales uses a certain range, and you for some reason want to have different boundaries based on those ranges. You can do that. Boundaries can be created either manually or automatically through the discovery process. But you should be aware of overlapping boundaries. You could imagine that you could have an IP subnet range and an IP address range that conflict, or an Active Directory site that contains clients that already exist in an IP address range. There could be confusion if you have these overlapping boundaries, which is allowed but not recommended. One major change in Configuration Manager 2012 is that boundaries are now available across the hierarchy. They are no longer confined to a single site as they were previously. So if you wanted the same boundaries in 5 different sites, you would have had to create them in each individual site. That is no longer the case. Further, boundaries need to be members of boundary groups. Boundary groups help clients find their assigned sites and content servers, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty important piece of the puzzle. Remember, overlapping boundaries can confuse clients. Another nice change is that there's no more need to manage boundary network connection speeds. For boundary group, you can specify the network speed for each site system server associated to the boundary group. Although you won't see this right now, you will see this in this course. So if this doesn't quite make sense, never fear, it will be explained. Another nice change for hierarchy settings. You can't have you can set it up so you don't have orphan clients anymore. So you can specify basically a fallback site for client assignment for clients that for whatever reason don't make it into one of your boundary groups. Perhaps you haven't created a boundary group for a particular Active Directory site for whatever reason. You can specify that any discovered clients that don't fit a boundary group are automatically assigned to a fallback site. Now the next action item would be to create boundaries. However, because you can do so in a couple of different ways, through the discovery process or manually, we're actually going to defer this until we do the discovery lesson in this course, which is coming right up. There are other site settings that are important to understand. Now, not all of these have to be messed with right now, but throughout your Configuration Manager journey, these are some items that you'll need to take a look at to make sure that they're set appropriately. When we start talking about management of clients, we want to make sure that we are setting the right management point for clients to talk to. That's a site setting that we'll look at in this course. What ports are being used for client management? What client-computer communication method is being used? We got to see this for management points and for distribution points. Are they using HTTP or HTTPS? Well, we can do the same thing for other roles as well, but you already got to see this in action for some of the site settings in this lesson. We are going to take a look at some other site properties before we leave this lesson, however. We'll do that in just a minute. We looked at some security permissions earlier on in this course, and you got to see that as part of the new role-based access control. But this is an important site setting to review before you move forward. There's also Wake on LAN configuration. Do you want computers to automatically wake up so they can be managed by Configuration Manager? And again, we'll see many of these items in action in this course. But for now, let's go over to the Configuration Manager server for Global Mantix and take a look at some more site properties. And we're back over at the Configuration Manager console now. And you'll notice I'm in the administration area and I'm in site configuration. That's really what we're interested in. And I've selected sites. And you'll see that we've got some information about our only site here. But if I right-click the site, there's a lot of things I can do here. I can add new roles, create a site system server, or even create a secondary site. I can also manage components, client installation settings, and other tools, including site maintenance, status summarizers, which we'll discover later on in this course when we look at reporting and alerting and monitoring, and other tools. But I'm most interested in properties. Here you can see that I can choose to enable Wake on LAN for this site if I want. Now right now, no site system has an out-of-band service point role assigned, so I have to have that role enabled before I can start provisioning computers with Wake on LAN capability. I'm not going to do that right now. We're going to actually do these things later on in this course. Here's where the ports are that I can configure for the current site. Ports 80, 443, and port 9 is used for Wake on LAN. You can send data to concurrent sites, publish data. Remember, this was publishing when we talked about publishing data to Active Directory. Well, here's where the site is actually configured to publish data into Active Directory. This was enabled automatically, by the way, by virtue of the fact that we had all of the Active Directory stuff configured appropriately. So when the site was installed, Active Directory publishing was enabled. Client computer communication will use either HTTPS or HTTP. If HTTPS is available, it will use it to communicate with site servers. We'll generate alerts when the free disk space on the site server database is low. Again, we want alerts generated when there's issues. And we have administrative users already defined, Administrator and Adam Savage. And we saw this earlier on in this course. Then we have signing and encryption for client computers when they communicate with the site. Right now, we don't need to worry about these because we're simply using HTTP for communication. And we saw these before, but if you wanted to make modifications to, say, the site database server role, there's not much to configure. So there's not really anything you can do with that role. You can't remove it either because it's required. A site system role. If you want to enable it to communicate with the internet, you'd use a fully qualified domain name. Right now, we're not doing that, but again, I want to show you where you find these things. We started by talking about management points in this lesson. Management points are the role and configuration manager that handles and facilitates communication between clients and site servers. Next, we talked about another critical point in Configuration Manager called the distribution point. This is the configuration manager role responsible for making sure that content is distributed to clients. Content can include things like software updates, operating system deployments, and application deployments. We then talked about the role of a high availability mechanism in Configuration Manager 2012 called the distribution point group. Remember, this is what coordinates content between all the various distribution points, synchronizes content between all the various distribution points. Next, we talked about boundaries and boundary groups. Although we did not configure any in this lesson, we will configure these as a part of the discovery lesson in this course. Then we quickly reviewed other site settings, just so you can see where things are found in the Configuration Manager console. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.